Hope it works. Great. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwaan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. My name is Ishan Sharma. And to deliver today's Karwaan special lecture, we have Professor Benjamin Zachariah with us, joining us from Calcutta this time. I'll just read out a brief introduction, though he doesn't need one. He was educated at Trinity College, Cambridge, and Calcutta University, and he did his PhD from University of Cambridge on Beyond Economics, Ideas of Developing India, 30s to 50s. And the vast areas of research interest that he has include the politics of historical knowledge, historical theory and historiography, history and memory, and global fascism. Very, very important in our times, I believe. The Cold War and decolonization, transnational revolutionary networks, the world wars and interwar political movements, and even sectarian conflicts in colonial South Asia. And most recently, I think, is the social and intellectual history of South Asia that has been the focus of Ben's work. And he has written multiple books, including the most recent was, if I'm not wrong, and Ben can correct me, after the last post, the Lives of Indian Historiography, which came in India in 2023 by Oxford University Press. And before that, he has written Nation Games, History and Historiographical Interpretation Imperatives, in India, which was De Guaiter's press in 2020, and Playing the Nation Game, The Ambiguities of Nationalism in India, that came in 2011 by Yoda, and the second edition of which was published in 2016. And today we are going to delve much deeper from, in the historiographical debate and discussions and I think you have nicely mentioned the title of it, like from complex secularism to the most recent Southistan. I would like to know about that idea that you are trying to develop, Ben. Over to you. And those who are watching us right now can always email us your questions at karwanheritage@gmail.com. We'll make sure that we share these emails with Ben, and he can reply to those emails with his answers. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I hope I can be uh, coherent enough to explain to you in the next 40 or so minutes what I have been considering as a problem that relates largely, though not exclusively, to the historiography of India. Now, this requires some explanation because everybody's perception of historiography really comes from where their historical training is. And my primary socialization as a historian was in Calcutta in India in the 1990s, which gives you a certain idea of where we were. A small event that happened right in the middle of my university degree was on December 9th, 1992, with the destruction of the Babri Masjid and the resultant changes, if you like, in the language of legitimacy with which we expressed ourselves. And I think that's something I had in mind when I put the words compulsory secularism in the title. The progression from that to what I'm calling global Southistan is where we move to a kind of imagined solidarity across the specifics of countries, and imagine a kind of collective of oppressed nations across the world whose perspectives need to be taken seriously and placed in the foreground. Now, this, if you like, is no longer so much about the rationality and rigor of the historical discipline, but it's more about accommodating affect and uh, trying to arrive at an empathetic account that does not offend anyone. Now, given that I always assumed that the duty of the historian was not to be concerned about who they were offending, but to be more concerned about whether they could produce a verifiable narrative which would then be possible to argue with on the basis of sources. Um, I think perhaps the idea that we inhabit this amorphous territory, which I'm calling global Southistan, where we imagine that it is those of us from the oppressed nations, or at least the formerly oppressed nations, or the collective victims of colonialism, that have to narrate our stories together, makes it a kind of compulsory solidarity, if you like, which is no less rigid, although quite different from where we started, in what I'm calling compulsory secularism. And if we look at it from the point of view of where we started, um, let's say before the language of legitimation changed, and we were talking about a historical world where people were automatically the heirs of their communities, and therefore the heirs of their communities' glories and evils, victimhoods and tragedies. And therefore, what happened to our ancestors or our perceived ancestors becomes a historical burden which we must bear to the present day, and we must try to avenge ourselves on the inheritors of our perceived ancestors' enemy. All sounds rather tribal, I suppose, but since tribal has moved from being a slightly pejorative term to a term to be celebrated, and I think this would need to be nuanced quite thoroughly, because a self ascribed term, tribal, as in a descriptive term describing one's collective, versus an evaluative term, tribal, describing a form of behavior that excludes outsiders and focuses on the internal, would have to be discussed in different terms. And we know very well that the same term can often give us different concepts, and the same concept can be given by different terms. But I wanted to start with a set of axiomatic texts which we were taught. And remember, this is important in the context of India because we have, for want of a better word, a compulsory framing of history. If you go back to the original documents of things like the foundations of the Indian History Congress, or the foundational moments of the University Grants Commission's history syllabus, it's very clear that what we teach is national history. We must teach ancient, medieval, and modern national history. And then we have a few choices: modern Europe, feudal Europe, maybe a little bit of Japan and China. You can get a little bit creative, but not too creative. And of course, there's always a lesson behind. And, we could talk about the axiomatic forms and syllabuses of various universities, but the thing to remember is how you teach it might be a little flexible, but what you teach is set by the uncles at the University Grants Commission. And so we start with a text that I think all of us read at various points in our lives. It was a little pamphlet by three then JNU professors, and it came out as a consequence of what was actually a history textbook controversy. And it was called Communalism and the Writing of Indian History. Now, remember, the model there is still that the historians are the experts, and the people they're talking to are the people who have to be taught what the correct perspective is. And um, essentially, this pamphlet, which was very effective, very convincing, and extremely important for history education in India and for the framing of the imagination of history educators at the university level as well as at the school level, was the idea that we must not tell communal histories. Now, what was meant by that was largely that you could twist the history of India to present it as a conflict of mainly the two large communities, the Hindus and the Muslims. And there was no point arguing that Hindu is an umbrella term that covers a whole bunch of people who thought of themselves differently over terms. That might have been a debate over terminology. Nor was it viable to really talk about the fact that Muslims were, for the most of their history, not perceived as a single block, or in many cases were not. But the problem to be solved was the communal history of Hindus versus Muslims. And three prominent professors would tell us how this worked for ancient Indian history, this how it worked for medieval Indian history, and how it worked for modern. And the framework was mainly that in ancient India there were various things depicted as a golden age, but we should be careful of golden age approaches, and that the projection of this golden age into a pristine past before Islam and the understanding that Hindus, as they are retrospectively called, were great until the Muslims arrived is a false narrative. The second part then went on to talk about the myth of Islam as oppressive and as damaging to Hindu life. And the third part, of course, talked about the communalization of modern Indian history. I will spare us all the details because A, it's an old text. B, many of us who became professional historians or who became involved in fields related to history, uh, of which there are many, have read this text. But I want to draw our attention to one thing that none of us questioned at the time, and this was interesting. We were the heirs of these ancient Indians, one way or the other. Nobody ever challenged in these texts the idea that the community that was built on an assumed continuity between our ancestors and us. So we were being encouraged not to see ourselves as um, a great ancient civilization if we were Hindu, or a dominant medieval civilization if we were Muslim. We were being encouraged not to set our histories against one another's, but nobody broke the chain between our history in the past and our lives in the present, which essentially meant that history becomes itself divided into us and them. And this was, of course, far from the intention. Yeah? The intention was, in fact, to explain that the narratives of horrible behavior on the part of this or that Hindu ruler or Muslim ruler, or this or that act of oppression against particular people, should not be placed in a larger chain of the Muslims must avenge themselves for their lost lands or their lost glory, or the Hindus must return to the pristine past before Islam messed it all up. And it was always pointed out to us that this framing of Indian history was given to us by the colonial rulers. That this idea should not be followed, in part because this was the schematic idea of the British written histories of India. So far, so good. Fast forward a few years, and we're still talking about textbooks, and we're talking about things such as the need not to offend the sensibilities of community. So now we may be talking about a smaller whole, but we're still talking about the necessary connect between ourselves and our given collective in the past. It's almost as if history is a form of imprisonment. And the reason I'm starting with these episodes, if you like, is that, and I regard myself as somebody who comes very firmly from a left tradition, we have, for the most part of the last 30 odd years, been fighting a peculiar battle. One is a purely negative battle to rescue the idea of India and the historical narrative of India from a sectarian Hindu nationalist telling, because these are the people rising to power and now in power. And in the process, there has been a slight lack, if you like, of serious self criticism on the part of the left itself. Uh, I think it would be fair to say that for many points in these last 30 years, the only thing the left had in common with one another was it considered itself not to be the right. And it becomes awkward at a certain point when the narratives of left and right are both based on certain common assumptions. And these common assumptions are that continuity of past versus past to the present in collectivities. And textbook controversy that we could talk about were possibly the early 2000s had a series of textbook changes. At the end of the first BJP-led coalition government, the return of a Congress-led coalition, and these are considered a very different genre of textbook. Unlike the early textbooks that we might have been glossing in texts such as Communalism in the Writing of Indian History, where experts told you what the truth was and how to think, we were now at a very different place. It was a more affective space, if you like. One of the things that framed narratives by this time was the contribution of X group to the national struggle. And it became awkward for groups who could not claim any such thing, because, in fact, in any situation of power, it might be important not to be claiming a genealogy to a movement of descent. It might, in fact, in other cases, be important to claim the protective capacity of state power if you are a minority too small or too weak to express yourself. Now, in the old framework, this would simply have been called collaboration with the colonial power. And this is where we start to look at a question of what is colonialism a little more close. Because the assumption of a monolithic and undifferentiated colonial state begins to look less coherent as you start to look at layers, contradictions, uh, conflicts within and among different organs of state power, and so on. We do this habitually for other states, so it seems a bit peculiar that we don't make this differentiation for the colonial state itself. Even more peculiar is the absolute dominance in the narrative of, I say in this case, Indian history, that has been taken up by the concept of the colonial. And if we pause for thought, this has been said before about the post colonial, that the dominant fact about any societies that have ever been colonized is that they were colonial. And there's no room to actually differentiate between societies which were colonized under very different material and ideological situations uh, by the 16th century Spanish conquistadors, or whether it's settler colonialism from a far later period, say in North Africa, or whether we're talking about an administered and carefully layered set of complex states in other places. It's colonialism. And this is where the idea of an undifferentiated whole comes in. And for the last 30 years or so, let us say, ever since we were studying the post colonial, details seem to be subordinated very often to the larger, shall we say, moral and social issues. Now, if we unpack some of these questions, we might find that there is an elitism inherent in the apparent radicalism as well. I'll give you one quick example because I think that it's important to keep in mind that an apparently radical challenge is often nothing of the sort. So the early subaltern studies group wished to tell a history from below. It ended up not really studying the peasant, but stereotyping the peasant and using the peasant as a figure that became the typical subaltern. Then the subaltern became a concept rather than a person. And we have the famous intervention where somebody answers in 70 pages the question, can the subaltern speak? And that's an awful lot of pages to say no. But this no is postulated on a peculiar act of appropriation for the person concerned, now an award winning academic. Subalternity is an absolute zero, right? As we know from our school science classes, absolute zero cannot be attained. But for her, the position of subalternity is the absolute inability to express oneself. Because any form of self expression or speaking raises oneself out of subalternity. But the pure subaltern cannot speak, she must be spoken for. And what better person to speak for the subaltern than a person who's the same nationality, well educated, articulate in English, and upper caste? Goes without saying, doesn't it? Now, in this situation, what is happening is, and it does make sense that these interventions came into history from literary studies, the historical details don't matter anymore. What we're interested in is how to place an entire society, conceptualized nationally, before an audience of predominantly, and that's what they called it, the West. Where is their West? Well, we'd like to know. But we wouldn't necessarily find out very easily. There was a term from an earlier group of people who were hailed by post-colonial theorists as their predecessors. One of them, Binoy Kumar Sarkar, called what they call the West Euro-America or Euro-America. And they seemed to like this idea, except the inconvenient detail was that Binoy Sarkar was a convinced fascist, and he was also a convinced supporter of the Nazi Party and worked strongly with them into the 1940s. So the origins of this Western versus us argument and its uses stretch into earlier histories, which are not very post-colonial, but are there to be seen. Why is this important at all? If we are tracing a progression, we are still in a world where there is a central narrative, and that central narrative is told from above. And it's told on the basis of a re-narration of ancient, medieval, and modern India on the model of communalism in the writing of Indian history. This is how we do it. The difficulty here, however, is even if you the accept the larger points of those narratives, it becomes impossible even to acknowledge one act of oppression, because that one act of oppression is a concession to the anti-national. Now, all of this becomes not difficult the moment you don't think that your history is a guide to your present day behavior in any direct sense. But that cannot be abandoned because we are still here talking about national history. And the point is to find a palatable national that will encompass us all. So, not too long ago, a commentator whose work I respect made the point about the vanishing of the Mughals from the new school textbooks under the current government. That this form of history telling made it impossible for all Indians to identify with some aspects of that history. And perhaps that's precisely the wrong thing to do. Because in the larger understanding of history, if we end up framing historical narrative to suit an idea of some fuzzy collective self, which becomes palatable for us all, we know what we're doing is building political mythology. But however much we might think this is politically useful, we don't want to be doing this as historians. And this is a resort to a category that actually hasn't been resorted to for a long time, and I think we've begun to need again. This is the idea that all history is potentially human history in the largest possible sense. Of course, we don't frame it like that because that circle of relevance is too large. I mean, in the same way that if you ask me why the curb is not dropped on this street corner, and my answer is it's capitalism or it's the Anthropocene, then my scale of answering is beyond the scale required to deal with a small problem. And this is what we're getting. Because whereas it's possible to argue at that scale, and most arguments at that scale are, as the physicist Wolfgang Pauli once pointed out, not even wrong. What do we do with them? So if we accept that the perspective that we adopt should take more feelings into account, should be respectful of the rights of minorities, of underrepresented people, of caste, gender, sexual orientation, and so on, then it's almost as if to acknowledge that these things were not always perfect in the narrative of the nation is disruptive. And yet, in every specific narrative, that's exactly what we do, because we write histories of the oppressed. And increasingly, we write histories of the oppressed as if the oppressed have affect but no agency. So the point is to prove how particular groups of people suffered under a particular regime. There was a time, for instance, when labor historians were almost without exception Marxist or quasi-Marxist. They were interested in levels of control, exploitation, to which the workforce had to submit. The only danger was that it was very easy for such histories to quickly become histories not of individual voices within a collective, but histories of structure, and almost implying that there were no ways of escaping the structure. One of my favorite examples is of the Lashkar who became a communist, Amir Haidar Khan, who traveled as a Lashkar on various ships, became a communist. Once he became a communist, the British track him um, as a communist, but not as a Lashkar. And when he gets on a ship, he is a communist masquerading as a Lashkar, even though he is actually a Lashkar. Now, in this situation, to show that you are more than your structure is to show that you have escaped the categories that bind you. And like a historian is not supposed to be a quantitative sociologist. So one imagines that a historian does not want to fix his characters as statistics, nor does he want to fix his characters as a framing narrative and only as a framing. Now, we haven't even begun to get into the debates where somebody says, don't call them fascist, call them Sangvad, because that's an indigenous term, which raises the further question of what on earth it is to be gained by using a term which has no analytic history, no analytic significance, and not even very much descriptive significance. So, for so many examples, we have a set of things we can begin to talk about. And we haven't talked about any specifics yet. We're talking about framing narratives. We're talking about devices that give you the continuity of past to present. We're talking about that which gives respect to different groups of people. One way of doing that was the contribution of X to the national movement. So everybody has to present their contribution to the national movement, and so on and so forth. So your frame is pre-given, and you must simply place your characters on that frame or within that frame. Or even worse, it's so flat that it's like sticking them on a grid um, and pinning them in the right spot so that you have the patterns you want. And history is a lot more messy than that. But we are trying to tell the history of a state that is quite diverse and cannot really be held together by a unifying narrative. And the search for that unifying narrative, however exciting it once was, in fact never worked. The nostalgia of the Nehruvian moment gives us this idea that the national in India is undefined. And that's the beauty of it. Because that is precisely what Nehruvian nationalists refuse to do. They refuse to define who is a national in any positive categories. A national was by default they who lived within the boundaries of the Republic of India. That, of course, made the Republic's borders themselves a very touchy issue. Now, we grew up with books stamped by the importer with a very peculiar stamp. It said, the boundaries of India as given in the maps in this book are neither correct nor authentic. We've all seen these stamps. They referred mainly to the shape of the state of Jammu and Kashmir, but also to some extent to where the border was drawn in Arunachal, the McMahon line. And the reason all this becomes touchy is that if you have an undefined national, then what gives you the nation state is its borders. And if the borders are negotiable, then you must define the national. And so this tension between the one and the other becomes a very peculiar one. And so from being this very laid back, undefined national, you start to get a very assertive defining of who is a national. And of course, since we're used to thinking of this in terms of Hindus and Muslims, it might come as a surprise to some of us to realize that the first people who suffered from this situation were Chinese origin Indians, who after 1962 were locked up in large numbers in what had been World War II camps. That had often been World War I camps before that. That had often been Boer War camps before that, but there are a few histories of who gets locked up where, which might come in to a framing here. The basic point being here that you are now busy defining who was a true national and who wasn't a true national. And this could only be done at the time, more or less visually, i.e., on the basis of race, thereby rounding up along with the Chinese a whole bunch of similar looking peoples in the northeast of India and so on and so forth. So you have come to a problem with the definition of national then. From that to history. If we are telling everybody's affective history, we need to hope that those affective histories simply line up together and don't come into conflict. But that's not going to happen. So it becomes impossible to tell a national story of consensus, tell the affective histories of each community, ethnicity, tribe, and nationality living within the borders of India. I use this term advisedly. I don't think India is a one nation state, given that nation seems to imply a community of language, culture, ethnicity, and so on, however you want to define it. There are several, certainly not two, but certainly not one either. So if people were looking at the concept of the national in any reasonable way, they would have abandoned the idea that one can tell this as a consensual project. They would also have abandoned the idea that one can connect oneself with one's presumed ancestors. Because as we know, both within and without national boundaries, people tend to mix, and ideas in particular don't observe national. Now, to bring this back to the telling of history. Between the understanding that it is our experience that should inform not only us, but the histories of the rest of the world, because theory should come from the global south, where we are all collectively in an imagined similar situation, which we are calling global Southistan. True to the idea that what we have are moral categories rather than historically nuanced categories. And back to the era where the experts told us what to think and how to frame our histories. In all these situations, we've had somebody setting up an idea of community. And all you could do against this is to set up a different idea of community. In this context, the communal people are only those who set their concept of community in a place where somebody else doesn't like it. And if that's all we have to defend ourselves against sectarian history, we don't have enough. And there's always the tension between the frank description of often unsavory incidents. Um, you can't tell a nationally consensual history of the beheadings of women by Sikh men to save their honor during the partition riots. You can't tell a history of harmony between colonizer and colonized in the story of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. But you shouldn't be expecting that a historical narrative has a very direct and almost parable like effect on the present. I think we haven't escaped that. That from the one situation where you must look the other way if one community has oppressed some other community in the past. Uh, because if you remember those stories of oppression too much, you damage the national fabric. To a situation where everybody has a place in the affective universe that is the table. And I'll end with, I think, a story which I only managed uh, to miss being a part of by a whisker. During these controversies about the 2000s textbooks, one of the political science textbooks had used a cartoon. It was of a giant snail being ridden by Dr. Ambedkar and being chased down a narrow path by Mr. Nehru, who had a little stick with which he was hitting the snail and trying to make him go faster. The snail was called the Constitution. Now, when this cartoon was published, it got the authors of the textbook into all kinds of trouble because some people implied that Dr. Ambedkar was being chased down the road by Mr. Nehru and being made to ride on an insulting beast. So the Bahan of Ambedkar cannot be a slave. Now your framing is getting a little connected to various other things. But in my view, and I nearly used that cartoon as the frontispiece for the Nehru book that I wrote, in my view, it would have been impossible for any contemporary to imagine that Nehru and Ambedkar were not equals in the context of the Constitution building. They represented different constituencies, they had different origins, but they were peers. And if you tell the history of India or of any place as the histories of communities and collectivities and of identities, then this equality must vanish in the face of their patently different social origin, reducing both to their social origins and impoverishing the understanding of. This doesn't help any larger narrative. It doesn't actually give us an overarching anything. But I think when we are playing with frames, it's worth seeing how self-referential the historiography of India has become and how it would in fact benefit from looking up a little and out. That's the best I can do with the time I have at hand. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that very interesting and engaging lecture. I think I've got many questions or at least themes that one should think about, ranging from the historical method, because now you mentioned the rewriting of history. There's always the question of where does the historical method lie in the rewriting of history, and that brings us to the question of the revisionist historiography, and also the fact that there is a debate going on in India today about public history versus academic, and the the old school approach of writing history versus the new social media kind of a history that is emerging. How do you see these kind of debates that goes around in contemporary India?
I mean, I have been following some very brave people who are actually trying to engage the public and getting into a lot of quite abusive debates. I think it's very commendable to imagine that you will be able to present a reasoned case based on verifiable facts and archives, which is something that we don't do amongst ourselves now. So to expect a public to want to do that is perhaps to expect too much, because we are in a world of spectacles and of a short time frame, and so we will buy the version of history that appeals to us. Did Rana Pratap really lose the battle of Haldighati? He can't have, because we want him to win. And is Akbar not as much a Rajput as Rana Pratap? No, that doesn't work, because he's the Mughal emperor. And we are used to thinking of the Mughal emperor as somehow Muslim, even though the ulama, certainly for the most part of Mughal rule, did not think that the Mughals were Muslim enough. So, you know, when we are stuck in this situation of how to reach an external audience, I usually think of it in two stages. I think that we need to do the rigorous research, the ability to convince our peers, and the corollary to that is to make peer review work properly rather than in a superficial manner. That's a longer story. But then once you have material that you should stand by, and you think it is of wider relevance, some of it isn't, quite clearly not. Some of it is purely of academic useful. But that which has a wider resonance needs to be disseminated, and it can't be disseminated in the same words as we would use to convince academics. The other side of that is there's no reason for academic writing to be so boring. Nobody asks people to write badly to be academics. It's just that they seem to think that they sound more pompous if they can't write. So your point is something I would answer in two stages. That you have to engage publicly, and you have to be very clear that this is a public engagement task that you're taking on. But that's not where you get your material from. Your material comes from exactly that old-fashioned internalist, disinterested ivory tower work that some people despise.
But do you think there should be certain amount of sometimes what happens in public history is they generalize, maybe there is a possibility of generalizing history of, because history, as you mentioned, is very complex. So maybe to dumb down, if we could call it, for the larger audience who might not have the training required to understand history, how do we deal with that idea?
I mean, I think we shouldn't. I think we should imagine that if we've understood it, then the problem is not one of understanding, it's the one of presentation. History is not a field where ordinary people can't understand. It's also not a field that everybody can get involved in, because it does involve a certain amount of training, it does involve a certain amount of patience. But its results don't need you to understand complicated mathematics, don't need you to understand extremely difficult words or concepts. A lot of the concepts can be explained very simply. And it's out of some kind of inferiority complex that we don't. We like to keep our jargon because it makes us feel it. I mean, I don't think I had a colleague who worked on Nazi Germany And he wasn't a very theoretical minded historian, but what he did say was, um, and I do agree with that, is there's nothing that you have researched and found that cannot be communicated to a wider audience. So when you write something, the long footnote at the bottom is for your peer who wants to know how you got to the argument. But you still can explain something and all its steps to anybody. But there's one step before that, which we're looking at. History education, and from a very young age, has been seized by people who are actually interested in propaganda. The uh, the ideological schools, shall we say, are much better funded and staffed than many other schools. And what we regard as absurd in narratives are not so absurd to people who went through school believing that certain mythological texts are history or some guide to history at least, and believing that there were vast hidden things that academic historians are deliberately hiding from us. And the last 30 years have contributed to that, either directly and deliberately or inadvertently, because if people say with great authority that they have no authority, then they might well be opening the doors to saying, well, I've studied for 20 years in the best universities in the world, got loads of money, have a very important funded professorship, which may be because of white guilt, but I have it nonetheless. And I'm telling you, oh, we can't know these things. What can we say about God and the birthplace of God that is relevant to people? We are only historians. Then people might say, well, if that's all you are, you don't have anything to tell us that you will stand by, then why should we listen? That has opened the door to a kind of bias history.
You know, another point that I think one can raise is about post-truth world, because you mentioned post-colonial, and I think we have moved beyond post-colonial and we have entered the post-truth world, where fact doesn't matter, or uh, people have their own facts that they
Yeah.
believe, and and faith plays a big part, because when you have faith in something, you really don't need facts to protect that faith. You believe in something, and that means that you believe in that. How does history function in this post-truth world? I think I can remember the brilliant book by Keith Jenkins, Rethinking History, which talks about this idea of post-truth and history.
I mean, I can well believe that if you don't believe that we share the perception of certain things across our differences, then at the very least, everybody is his or her own historian, and everybody embodies his or her own history. And so no two people are in the same universe, but not, you need collectivities. So that infinite fragmentation is just as much an ideal world construct as the idea that we have this unifying collectivity in any nation state or in any collectivity that is larger. In the universal class failed as much as the nation state did. So, we didn't actually get from one to the other. But in the absence of the idea that we can verify what we know, or better put, in the absence of the idea that truth is not absolute, but we know a lie when we see one, there is no history. That's all right. Most historians seem to want there to be no history. Um, and so, what are we looking for? Are we looking for a consensual narrative, or are we looking for an account of what happened before that is relevant and intelligible to the present? Now, that's a minimalist view of what history is. And if it's relevant and intelligible to the present only in as much as we are in the same nation or tribe, then we make ourselves irrelevant to everybody else. And we cannot make solidarities create larger worlds because a kind of intrinsically birth given solidarity cannot get bigger or smaller. It can only convince the own constituency that is pre given. I might convince every Hindu I know that we have a Hinduness in common. But to invite anybody who doesn't even have that potential or that background to see that as an appealing thing to join our collective won't happen. For that, you need ideas that are more universal. We don't have those unless we have an idea of not cultural fact or truth, but intersubjective verifiability. And I don't know if this can be enforced. It certainly can't be enforced from above. So if the discipline of history dies, it won't entirely have been killed. It would have in part committed suicide.
Thank you so much, uh, Ben, for taking up time to deliver this lecture. I think the points that you have raised might be challenging for a lot of people, and including me, because it is interesting. The new, I think we must engage in these discussions, especially in history circles now, because uh, certainly we need to rethink how we practice history now, uh, considering the communal angle that you mentioned is taking over, and it is taking over because uh, we have to reinvent, so to say, our methods and have a relook at the historical methods and historiography. And I think you have given us food for thought, and we hope that we engage in more discussions and debates on this. Thank you so much uh, for taking our time, and for those who are watching us, this is the reminder that if you have questions uh, that you would like to ask Ben, please write to us on karwanheritage@gmail.com. We'll make sure that you send your questions directly to him and he can get back to you on email. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and thank you, Ben, again for accepting the invitation.
Thank you very much.